The crowbar wasn't supposed to be there. When the ground-penetrating radar swept across Section 9 of the Silver Ridge mine in 2023, it caught something that shouldn't exist: a sealed chamber, perfectly preserved, containing tools that had been deliberately modified. Patrick Elias Morgan had walked into that tunnel 82 years earlier and never walked out. The company called it an accident. His best friend called it murder. And in a leather-bound diary hidden in an attic for 8 decades, the truth had been waiting. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The desert wind carried dust across the town of Silver Ridge, Nevada, on the morning of March 15th, 1941. Patrick Elias Morgan stood outside the company boarding house, his lunch pail in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. At 33 years old, he had the weathered look of a man who had spent half his life underground, his hands calloused and strong, his eyes carrying that particular alertness that came from years of watching for danger in the darkness. He had arrived in Silver Ridge 6 years earlier, one more soul drawn by the promise of steady work in the silver mines that had made a handful of men wealthy and kept hundreds of others fed. Patrick wasn't chasing fortune. He was chasing stability, something to build a life on. Maybe enough to bring his younger sister out from Missouri, once he had saved enough for a proper house. The mine whistle cut through the morning air, signaling the start of the day shift. Patrick joined the stream of men walking toward the mine entrance, their boots crunching on the gravel road. He nodded to familiar faces, exchanged brief words about the weather, the usual morning ritual. Silas Robert Crane fell into step beside him, carrying his own gear. Silas was 41. A veteran miner with nearly 20 years of experience in silver operations across Nevada and Colorado. He had taken Patrick under his wing when the younger man first arrived, teaching him the subtle signs of unstable rock, the way sound changed in different tunnels, the 100 small lessons that kept a miner alive. They had become friends over those years, the kind of friendship forged in shared danger and mutual respect. Silas had a family, a wife named Dorothy, and 3 children who lived in a small house on the edge of town. Patrick often joined them for Sunday dinners, playing cards with the kids and helping Dorothy with repairs around the property. It was the closest thing to family Patrick had found since leaving Missouri, and he valued it more than he could express. Silas understood what it meant to build something lasting, to work toward a future that extended beyond the next paycheck. The Silver Ridge Mining Company operated on a scale that impressed even experienced miners. The main shaft descended 600 feet into the earth, with lateral tunnels branching out like the roots of an enormous tree. The company employed nearly 200 men across 3 shifts, extracting silver ore that was processed in the mill on the surface before being shipped to refineries. It was profitable work, and the company took pride in its safety record. Or at least the safety record it presented to investors and regulatory officials. The reality underground was more complicated. Equipment wore out faster than it was replaced. Support timbers were sometimes placed further apart than recommended. Small cave-ins were reported as minor incidents rather than warning signs. Patrick and Silas had been assigned to Section 9 for the past 3 months. It was deep work, nearly 500 feet down and 300 feet laterally from the main shaft. The vein they were following showed promising silver content, rich enough that the company foreman, a hard man named Dutch Holloway, checked their progress daily. Dutch had made it clear he expected results, that bonuses and continued employment depended on maintaining production quotas. Most miners understood this as the normal pressure of the job, but Patrick and Silas had started noticing something else in Dutch's attention. He seemed particularly interested in the exact path of the vein they were following, asking detailed questions about the rock composition, the width of the deposit, the direction it seemed to be heading. 3 weeks before Patrick's disappearance, they had broken through into a small natural cavity in the rock. It wasn't uncommon, the geology of the region created pockets and fissures, but this one revealed something significant. The silver vein didn't just continue, it widened dramatically, spreading out in multiple directions. Patrick had stood in that cavity with his carbide lamp held high, examining the glittering streaks in the rock face. He turned to Silas with barely contained excitement. Recognizing what they had found, this wasn't just a continuation of the existing operation. This was the kind of deposit that could justify expanding the entire mine. that could mean years of steady work and potential profit-sharing bonuses. They reported the discovery to Dutch Holloway that same day. The foreman came down to inspect it personally, bringing 2 company engineers and the mine supervisor, a man named Calvin Cross, who answered directly to the ownership. They spent an hour examining the cavity, taking samples, making notes. Patrick noticed the way they talked among themselves in low voices, noticed how Dutch kept glancing at him and Silas with an expression that was hard to read. When they finally left, Dutch gave explicit instructions. Patrick and Silas were to continue their regular work, but were not to discuss the discovery with anyone else. The company needed time to assess the find properly before making any decisions about expansion or publicity. That order struck Patrick as odd. Miners talked. It was part of the culture underground. Discoveries were shared, debated, speculated about. Asking men to stay silent about a significant find went against the natural flow of mining camp life. He mentioned this to Silas that evening as they cleaned up after their shift. Silas had frowned, his weathered face showing concern. He said there were politics involved, probably related to mining claims and property rights. The Silver Ridge Company owned the current operation, but depending on where the vein extended, it might cross into adjacent land that belonged to other parties. Legal complications could tie things up for years, so the company would want to secure its position before word spread. Patrick accepted this explanation, but doubt lingered in his mind. Over the following weeks, he paid closer attention to the people who came and went from Section 9. He noticed that Dutch Holloway started bringing different men down to examine their work area, men Patrick didn't recognize from the regular crews. Some wore suits and carried briefcases, clearly company officials or investors rather than miners. Others had the look of experienced prospectors, men who could read rock like others read books. They would stand in the cavity for a while, conferring quietly, then leave without speaking to Patrick or Silas. The atmosphere in Section 9 began to change. Dutch Holloway grew more demanding about production rates, pushing Patrick and Silas to extend the tunnel faster than safety really allowed. He complained about the time they spent checking support structures, said they were being too cautious. When Silas pushed back, citing standard safety protocols, Dutch told him bluntly that the company had invested significant resources in this section and needed to see returns. Men who couldn't keep up the pace would be reassigned to less desirable positions, or possibly let go entirely. In 1941, with war tensions rising and economic uncertainty everywhere, the threat of unemployment carried real weight. Patrick found himself working longer hours, sometimes staying an extra shift to meet Dutch's expectations. He was tired in a way that went beyond normal physical exhaustion, the kind of weariness that came from sustained stress and inadequate rest. His hands developed new calluses, his shoulders ached from swinging the pickaxe, and his lungs felt perpetually coated with dust, despite the ventilation fans. He wrote letters to his sister in Missouri, telling her about the discovery, but also expressing concern about the increasing pressure at work. In one letter dated March 10, 1941, he wrote that something felt wrong about the whole situation, that he was considering looking for work at one of the other mining operations in the region, once he had saved a bit more money. Silas Crane was experiencing similar doubts. He had been in mining long enough to recognize when company politics started trumping safety considerations. He began keeping detailed notes about their work in Section 9, documenting the production demands, the condition of equipment, the number and quality of support timbers being provided. These notes went into a leather-bound diary he kept, a habit he had developed years earlier after witnessing a preventable accident that the company had tried to cover up. The diary became his way of maintaining an honest record, something that could speak truth if official reports were ever falsified. He didn't tell Patrick about the diary, seeing no reason to involve the younger man in what might become a whistleblowing situation. On March 14th, the day before Patrick's disappearance, something significant happened. Patrick and Silas were working their regular shift in Section 9 when they heard voices approaching from the main tunnel. Dutch Holloway appeared with 2 men Patrick had seen before among the well-dressed visitors. Dutch told Patrick and Silas to take an early break, to go back to the main shaft and wait there for further instructions. This was unusual enough to be alarming. Miners didn't leave their work area without good reason, and the tone in Dutch's voice suggested this wasn't a request. They complied, gathering their tools and heading back toward the main shaft. As they walked away, Patrick glanced over his shoulder and saw the three men entering the cavity where the major silver deposit had been discovered. One of them was unrolling what looked like survey maps. Patrick mentioned this to Silas, asking what he thought was going on. Silas kept his voice low as they walked, saying he suspected the company was preparing to expand operations without giving Patrick and Silas credit for the discovery. Bonuses and recognition would go to company engineers and supervisors instead of the men who had actually found the vein. This suspicion hardened into conviction when they reached the surface and found they had been docked, pay for the hours they hadn't worked. When Silas complained to the shift supervisor, he was told that orders from Dutch Holloway were to be followed without question, and any further complaints would result in termination. It was a blunt reminder of the power dynamics in a company town where employment options were limited and blacklisting was a real possibility. Silas let the matter drop publicly, but that evening he wrote extensively in his diary about the incident, noting the date, the names involved, and his growing concern that something illegal or at least deeply unethical was happening with the Section 9 discovery. Patrick didn't sleep well that night. He lay in his bunk at the boarding house, listening to the sounds of other miners snoring and shifting in their sleep, thinking about the situation. Part of him wanted to confront Dutch Holloway directly, to demand answers about why they were being sidelined from a discovery they had made. Another part of him recognized the futility of such confrontation. He was one man in a system designed to benefit ownership and management, not labor. The best he could hope for was to keep his head down, continue working, and eventually move on to something better. The worst outcome would be losing his job and any chance of that stability he had been working toward. March 15th dawned cold and clear. Patrick went through his morning routine, packed his lunch pail, filled his thermos with coffee that was more chicory than actual beans. He met Silas outside the boarding house, and they walked to the mine together, as they had done hundreds of times before. Neither of them spoke much that morning. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with weather or personal conflict, more a sense that events were moving towards some kind of resolution, though neither man could have said what form that resolution might take. The day shift began normally enough. Patrick and Silas descended in the cage elevator, that rickety wooden platform that dropped miners into darkness with alarming speed. They followed the main tunnel to the lateral passage that led to Section 9, their carbide lamps casting moving shadows on the rock walls. Other crews branched off to their assigned areas. The sound of pickaxes on stone, the rumble of ore carts, the distant thud of dynamite blasts deeper in the mine, all the familiar soundtrack of underground work surrounded them. When they reached Section 9, they found Dutch Holloway waiting for them. He had another man with him, someone Patrick didn't recognize, a heavy-set fellow with a scar across his left cheek and the hard eyes of someone who had done violence in his life. Dutch introduced him as Raymond Burke, said he would be working with them for a few days to assess the structural integrity of their tunnel. This explanation made little sense. Structural assessments were done by company engineers, not by random workers who appeared without warning. Patrick exchanged a glance with Silas, seeing his own suspicion reflected there, but neither man voiced their doubts. Dutch gave them their assignment for the day. They were to extend the tunnel another 12 feet, placing support timbers at intervals Dutch specified. These intervals were wider than standard safety protocols recommended, a fact Silas pointed out immediately. Dutch's response was sharp. He said the company engineers had reviewed the rock composition and determined that the stone in this section was stable enough to allow for wider spacing. Closer spacing was unnecessary and wasteful. If Silas had concerns, he could take them up with the mine supervisor, but in the meantime he was expected to follow instructions. Silas let it go, but Patrick could see the anger in his friend's face. They began work, Patrick wielding the pickaxe while Silas positioned and secured the support timbers. Raymond Burke watched them from a position near the tunnel entrance, not helping, just observing. His presence was unnerving in ways Patrick couldn't quite articulate. The man didn't behave like a safety inspector or a structural assessor. He behaved like someone standing guard, making sure people stayed where they were supposed to be. Around mid-morning, Dutch Holloway returned. He spoke briefly with Raymond Burke in low tones Patrick couldn't make out over the sound of his own pickaxe striking stone. Then Dutch called Silas over, said he needed him to come back to the main shaft to sign some paperwork related to their production reports. Silas hesitated, clearly not wanting to leave Patrick alone with these two men. But refusing a direct order from a foreman was grounds for immediate termination. He told Patrick he'd be back shortly, then followed Dutch down the tunnel and out of sight. Patrick continued working, trying to ignore Raymond Burke's presence. He focused on the rock face, on the rhythm of swing and strike, on the way the stone fractured under repeated impacts. The silver vein they were following continued here, visible as bright streaks in the darker stone. It was good ore, the kind that made the physical labor feel worthwhile. He thought about the discovery in the cavity behind him, about the potential wealth locked in this underground darkness, wealth that would enrich company owners while men like himself earned barely enough to survive. Raymond Burke spoke for the first time since Silas had left. His voice was rough, damaged perhaps by years of breathing mine dust. He asked Patrick how long he had been working this section. Patrick answered briefly, not encouraging conversation. Burke asked about the discovery, about how extensive Patrick thought the silver vein might be. These questions felt like interrogation rather than casual workplace chat. Patrick gave vague answers, saying he wasn't a geologist and couldn't make accurate assessments. Burke persisted, asking if Patrick had told anyone outside the company about what they had found. Patrick said no, following the instructions Dutch had given weeks earlier. Burke seemed satisfied with this response. He moved closer to where Patrick was working, examining the rock face with what appeared to be genuine interest. He commented that it was impressive, that Patrick and Silas had done good work in following the vein this far. Then he said something that made Patrick's blood run cold. He said it was too bad the vein was about to become inaccessible, that the company had decided this section was too geologically unstable to continue operations. Patrick stopped swinging his pickaxe, turned to face Burke directly. He asked what that meant, because there was nothing unstable about this section. The rock was solid. The support structures were adequate despite being spaced too widely. Burke shrugged, said he was just relaying what he'd been told. The decision had been made at levels above his pay grade. This section would be closed down, sealed off, declared too dangerous for further work. Patrick felt anger rising in his chest. He asked if this was about the discovery, if the company was planning to shut them out and then reopen the section with different crews who wouldn't ask questions about credit or bonuses. Burke didn't answer, just gave Patrick a long, appraising look that communicated more than words could have. Before Patrick could press the issue further, there was a sound from deeper in the tunnel, back toward the cavity where the main silver deposit had been found. It was a sharp crack, like a large timber breaking under stress. Both men turned toward the sound. Burke's hand went to something at his belt. A tool, or possibly a weapon. Patrick couldn't tell in the dim light. Another crack followed, then a rumbling that Patrick recognized with gut-level terror. Rock fall. Something was collapsing in the tunnel behind them. Burke moved fast for a big man. He shoved Patrick hard, sending him stumbling toward the tunnel entrance, toward safety. Patrick caught himself against the rock wall, his carbide lamp swinging wildly and throwing crazy shadows. He heard Burke running, heard the roar of falling rock growing louder. Dust began billowing down the tunnel, thick and choking. Patrick's training kicked in. He ran toward the main passage, toward fresh air and escape routes, his boots pounding on the stone floor. He had gone perhaps 30 feet when he realized Burke wasn't behind him. He stopped, turned back, could see nothing but dust and darkness. The rumbling had stopped, but the air was full of suspended particles that made breathing difficult. Patrick called out, asking if Burke was there, if he was hurt. No answer came. Patrick took several steps back toward Section 9, calling again. His mind raced with calculation. Going back into a fresh collapse zone was potentially suicidal. Rock could still be shifting. Support timbers could be failing. Toxic gases might be accumulating. But leaving a man trapped went against every code miners live by. He had taken perhaps a dozen steps back toward the collapse when a hand grabbed his shoulder from behind. He spun, startled, found himself face to face with Silas Crane. His friend's face was pale with fear, his eyes wide. Silas demanded to know what had happened, where Burke was, why Patrick was running toward danger instead of away from it. Patrick explained quickly, the sounds of collapse, Burke shoving him toward safety, the sudden silence after the rumbling stopped. Silas pulled Patrick back toward the main tunnel, saying they needed to alert the rescue crews. That going into a fresh collapse without proper equipment and support was suicide. they reached the main shaft and raised the alarm. Within minutes, the mine was in controlled chaos. The cage elevator ran continuously, bringing up the day shift workers and bringing down rescue crews with specialized equipment. Dutch Holloway appeared, demanding to know what had happened. Silas explained what Patrick had told him, describing the collapse in Section 9. Dutch's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, anger, calculation, finally settling into grim determination. He organized the rescue effort, pulling together the most experienced miners, gathering ropes and extra timbers and medical supplies. The rescue team, including Patrick and Silas, descended back into the mine. They made their way carefully to Section 9, testing the air quality, checking for structural instability. What they found was worse than a simple collapse. The tunnel had been completely blocked by fallen rock about 50 feet from where Patrick and Burke had been working. Tons of stone had come down, filling the passage from floor to ceiling. It would take days to clear, possibly longer, and there was no way to know if Burke was alive on the other side or if he had been crushed in the initial collapse. The rescue crews began the careful work of removing rock, shoring up the tunnel as they went, listening for any signs of life from the other side. Patrick worked alongside them, driven by guilt and confusion. He kept replaying those final moments: Burke's shove that had probably saved his life, the man's decision to stay behind, or inability to follow. Nothing made sense. The collapse had happened too suddenly, too completely. In his 6 years of mining, Patrick had seen rock falls before. They usually gave warning: small cascades of pebbles, the groaning of stressed timbers, visible cracks spreading through stone. This had been different, more like a deliberate demolition than a natural failure. Silas shared these suspicions. As they worked side by side clearing rubble, he mentioned quietly that he wanted to examine the collapse zone carefully once they broke through. Something about this didn't feel like accident or natural disaster. Patrick agreed, though he couldn't articulate why. It was a feeling in his gut, a sense that events were unfolding according to someone's plan rather than chance. They worked through the rest of the day shift and into the night. Crews rotated out for rest breaks, but the work continued without pause. Dutch Holloway stayed underground the entire time, supervising, making decisions about which rocks to move and how to reinforce the tunnel as they excavated. By midnight, they had cleared about 20 feet, hard progress through densely packed rubble. There was still no sign of Raymond Burke, no sounds from beyond the collapse zone, nothing to indicate whether the man was alive or dead or simply not there at all. Around 2 a.m, one of the rescue workers called out. He had found something in the rubble, not rock but wood, pieces of what appeared to be a support timber. Patrick moved closer to examine it. Even in the uncertain light of carbide lamps, he could see that the timber hadn't broken naturally. The wood showed marks that looked like they had been made by a saw or chisel, deliberate cuts that would weaken the structure without being immediately visible. He pointed this out to Silas, who examined the piece carefully, running his fingers over the cut marks. Dutch Holloway pushed through the rescue crew to see what they had found. Patrick showed him the timber, explained what the marks suggested. Dutch took the piece of wood, studied it for a moment, then dismissed it. He said the timber must have been damaged during the collapse itself, that rocks falling with sufficient force could create all kinds of markings. Patrick started to argue, but Silas put a hand on his arm, a warning to stay quiet. Dutch ordered the rescue work to continue, had the piece of timber taken to the surface for later examination. An examination Patrick suspected would never actually occur. They continued digging. By dawn on March 16th, they had cleared 35 feet of the 50-foot collapse zone. The work was exhausting, made more difficult by the need to constantly reinforce their excavation to prevent secondary collapses. Men rotated through in shifts now, getting a few hours of rest before returning to the effort. Patrick and Silas stayed underground longer than they should have, driven by the need to understand what had really happened. At around 8 a.m. on March 16th, the rescue team broke through the collapse zone. They emerged into a section of tunnel that was still intact, dusty but structurally sound, and they found no sign of Raymond Burke. The man had simply vanished. His tools were there, leaning against the tunnel wall. His lunch pail sat unopened, but Burke himself was gone, as if he had never existed. The rescue team searched the intact section thoroughly, checking every crevice and shadow, finding nothing. Dutch Holloway stood in that empty tunnel section, his face unreadable in the lamplight. After a long moment of silence, he declared that Burke must have been buried in the collapse itself, that his body was somewhere in the tons of rock they had just cleared. They would need to sift through all the rubble on the surface to locate his remains. This explanation satisfied most of the rescue crew, tired men who wanted to believe the logical answer. But Patrick noticed something that Dutch seemed to miss or deliberately ignored. If Burke had been caught in the initial collapse, if he had been standing anywhere near the fall zone, there should have been blood on the rocks, torn clothing, some physical evidence of a human body being crushed and buried. The rubble they had cleared was clean, nothing but stone and timber. Patrick tried to raise this point with Dutch, to ask where Burke's body actually was, but the foreman cut him off sharply. He said Patrick had been through a traumatic experience, that he needed rest and time to process what had happened, that speculation wasn't helpful. The rescue effort was officially concluded. All crews were to return to the surface for debriefing and evaluation. The section would be permanently sealed, declared too unstable for future operations. This declaration came less than 24 hours after the collapse, far too quickly for any proper geological assessment. Back on the surface, Patrick found himself separated from Silas during the debriefing process. Company officials interviewed them individually, asking detailed questions about what they had seen and heard before the collapse. Patrick told the truth as he understood it, describing Burke's presence, the sounds of rock fall, his escape from the tunnel. But the officials seemed more interested in what Patrick might have told people outside the company about the silver discovery in Section 9. They asked repeatedly if he had written letters mentioning the find, if he had discussed it with anyone in town, if he had any documentation or samples. Patrick said he had mentioned the discovery to his sister in Missouri, but had provided no technical details, and he certainly had taken no samples since that was strictly forbidden by company rules. The interview felt more like an interrogation, and by the time it concluded, Patrick was exhausted and confused. He emerged from the company office to find Silas waiting for him outside. His friend looked grim, his jaw set in anger. Silas said they needed to talk, but not here, not where company officials might overhear. They walked to Silas's house on the edge of town, where Dorothy greeted them with concern and hot coffee. Silas sent the children outside to play, then sat Patrick down at the kitchen table. Silas had reached conclusions during his own debriefing. He believed Raymond Burke was not a safety inspector or structural assessor, but someone brought in to sabotage the Section 9 tunnel. The collapse had been deliberate, designed to seal off access to the silver discovery. Burke had probably escaped through a different route, possibly through the cavity itself, if there were other passages the company hadn't disclosed. The entire event was a cover-up, a way to remove Patrick and Silas from the equation, while the company secured legal control over the expanded silver vein. Dutch Holloway was almost certainly involved, possibly acting on orders from mine supervisor Calvin Cross, or even higher company officials. Patrick listened to this theory with growing horror. If Silas was right, they had been marked for elimination, or at least removal. The collapse had been intended to frighten them, to justify their dismissal or relocation. But something had gone wrong with the plan, possibly Burke's presence in the tunnel when the collapse occurred, assuming Burke was meant to trigger the sabotage and then escape before anyone noticed. Patrick asked what they should do, whether they should go to local authorities or contact state mining regulators. Silas shook his head slowly. He said the company had too much influence in Silver Ridge, that local law enforcement was essentially bought and paid for, that state regulators would take months to investigate, by which time all evidence would be destroyed or buried. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and contemplating their limited options. Finally, Silas said he had been documenting everything in his diary, all the suspicious activities, the pressure to increase production, the unusual visitors to Section 9, the warnings about staying quiet regarding their discovery. If anything happened to him, Dorothy knew where the diary was hidden and had instructions to send it to a journalist Silas knew in Carson City, someone who had exposed mining company corruption before. Patrick felt a chill hearing this. The fact that Silas was making contingency plans suggested he believed they were in real danger, not just of losing their jobs, but possibly their lives. The next several days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Patrick and Silas returned to work, but they were reassigned to a different section of the mine, shallow work closer to the main shaft. It was obvious they were being watched, their movements tracked, their conversations monitored by foremen who had never paid them much attention before. Dutch Holloway largely ignored them now, having moved on to managing other crews. Section 9 was officially sealed, heavy timbers placed across the tunnel entrance and marked with warning signs about unstable geology. Patrick noticed other changes around the mine. Several of the well-dressed visitors who had been examining Section 9 in previous weeks returned, but now they met with company officials in the surface offices rather than going underground. Legal documents were filed at the county courthouse, claims and surveys that Patrick tried to examine but was denied access to. The company was clearly moving forward with plans related to the silver discovery, doing it quietly and quickly, before anyone outside the organization could raise questions. On March 20th, 5 days after the collapse, Patrick received a message that his sister in Missouri had fallen ill. The telegram provided few details but urged him to return home immediately. Patrick went to the mine office to request leave, found himself meeting with Calvin Cross directly. Something that never happened for ordinary workers. Cross was sympathetic, said family emergencies took priority, approved 2 weeks of unpaid leave effective immediately. The speed and ease of this approval felt suspicious. Patrick mentioned this to Silas, who advised him not to go, said it might be a setup to get him away from Silver Ridge so the company could act without any witnesses to contradict their narrative. But the telegram about his sister seemed genuine, the details specific enough that Patrick couldn't dismiss it as fabrication. He decided to go to Missouri to make the journey and confirm his sister's condition, then return to Nevada and figure out his next steps. Silas wasn't happy about this decision, but understood family obligations couldn't be ignored. They met one final time at Silas's house on the evening of March 20th. Silas gave Patrick a sealed envelope, told him not to open it unless something happened to prevent Patrick from returning to Silver Ridge. The envelope contained key pages from Silas's diary, documentation of everything suspicious that had occurred over the past months. If Patrick was forced to disappear or found himself unable to return, he was to mail the envelope to the journalist in Carson City. Patrick left Silver Ridge on the morning of March 21st, 1941, taking a bus to Reno and then a train east toward Missouri. He carried one small bag of personal possessions, his saved earnings hidden in a money belt under his shirt, and the sealed envelope Silas had given him. The journey would take several days, crossing the desert and plains, moving through a country that was edging closer to war, even if most citizens didn't realize it yet. Patrick spent the travel time thinking about everything that had happened, about the collapse and the sealed tunnel and the suspicious circumstances surrounding it all. He never reached Missouri. Somewhere in the transit, probably in the confusion of train transfers and crowded stations, Patrick Elias Morgan disappeared. Whether he chose to vanish deliberately, sensing danger, or whether something more sinister occurred, remained unclear for the next 82 years. His sister in Missouri, who had never sent any telegram, grew concerned when Patrick failed to arrive or respond to her letters. She eventually contacted the Silver Ridge Mining Company, which claimed Patrick had left their employment on March 21st, and they had no information about his current whereabouts. Local authorities in Missouri investigated briefly but found no evidence of foul play, just another case of a man who had moved on without maintaining family ties. Back in Silver Ridge, Silas Robert Crane refused to believe Patrick had simply vanished. He continued working at the mine, continued documenting everything in his diary, and waited for his friend to return or make contact. Weeks passed, then months. By summer of 1941, Silas had to accept that Patrick was gone, one way or another. He tried to raise questions with company officials, asked about the last time anyone had seen Patrick, about whether the company had any responsibility to track down missing employees. These questions earned him warnings about causing trouble, about making accusations without evidence. In August of 1941, Silas Crane was killed in a mine accident. The official report described a cable failure in the cage elevator, a mechanical malfunction that sent the elevator plummeting 60 feet before safety mechanisms engaged. Silas was one of 4 miners in the cage at the time. The other 3 survived with serious injuries. Silas did not. The funeral was well attended. The company sent representatives and flowers, and Dorothy Crane became a widow with 3 children to raise alone. The company provided a small death benefit, enough to cover immediate expenses, but not enough to maintain the family long term. What the official report didn't mention was that the cable hadn't failed naturally. Two other miners, men who had no reason to lie and nothing to gain from stirring up trouble, told Dorothy privately that they had seen someone working on the cable mechanism shortly before the accident, someone who wasn't part of the regular maintenance crew. They didn't recognize the person, couldn't provide a clear description, but the timing was suspicious. Dorothy listened to this information with a grief-stricken face and thanked them for their honesty. She didn't go to authorities with the allegation. She had 3 children to feed and nowhere to go if the company blacklisted her family. But Dorothy did remember what Silas had told her about his diary, about the documentation of suspicious activities at the mine. She found the leather-bound journal hidden exactly where he said it would be, in a metal box buried in the crawl space beneath their house. She read through it carefully, her hands shaking as she recognized the evidence her husband had gathered, evidence that suggested both he and Patrick Morgan had been murdered because of what they had discovered underground. The diary documented everything: the silver find, the pressure from company officials, the suspicious visitors, the timber with saw marks, Silas's conviction that the Section 9 collapse had been deliberate sabotage. Dorothy wanted to send the diary to the journalist in Carson City as Silas had instructed, but fear held her back. She had 3 children depending on her survival. Exposing the mining company would make her a target, would likely result in her being driven out of Silver Ridge with no resources and no prospects. So she made a different choice. She kept the diary hidden, maintaining it as potential evidence if circumstances ever changed, if there ever came a time when revealing the truth wouldn't destroy her family in the process. The metal box went back under the house, and Dorothy never spoke of it again. Over the following decades, Dorothy Crane raised her children in Silver Ridge. The mining company continued operations, eventually playing out the known silver deposits and scaling back employment. The town shrank as people moved away to find work elsewhere. Dorothy eventually remarried to a railroad worker named George Patterson, who was kind to her children and asked no questions about the past. She moved with him to Reno in 1953, leaving Silver Ridge behind but taking the metal box with her, still hidden, still containing Silas's diary. Dorothy Patterson died in 1998 at the age of 81. Her estate was small, mostly personal possessions distributed among her 3 surviving children. One of them, Catherine Rosenberg, discovered the metal box while cleaning out her mother's attic. She opened it to find the leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed but still readable. Catherine read through her father's words with tears streaming down her face, learning for the first time about the circumstances surrounding his death, about his suspicions regarding Patrick Morgan's disappearance, about the silver discovery that had set everything in motion. Catherine contacted a local historian who specialized in Nevada mining history, shared the diary with him, asked if the allegations it contained could be verified after so many decades. The historian, a professor named Vincent Hayes, who taught at the University of Nevada, Reno, was fascinated by the document. He began researching the Silver Ridge Mining Company, tracking down whatever records still existed from 1941. Most of the company archives had been destroyed or lost over the years, but he found references to Section 9 and geological surveys filed with state agencies, found documentation of the silver claims that had been registered shortly after Patrick Morgan's disappearance. Hayes published a paper in 2004 about the case, presenting Silas Crane's diary as a primary source document and arguing that the Section 9 collapse appeared to have been an act of industrial sabotage rather than accident. The paper generated some interest in academic and mining history circles, but didn't lead to any official investigation. Everyone involved was long dead. The mining company itself had gone through multiple ownership changes and was no longer a functioning entity. And the legal obstacles to reopening a case from 1941 were substantial. For nearly 20 more years, the story of Patrick Elias Morgan remained an unsolved historical mystery, another tragedy from Nevada's mining era. Interesting to researchers, but forgotten by the general public. The Silver Ridge mine itself sat abandoned, the tunnels sealed, the surface buildings slowly collapsing under the weight of desert weather and time. The land changed hands several times, ending up in the possession of a development company that was considering options for the property, possibly tourist attractions or historical preservation projects. In 2022, that development company commissioned a comprehensive survey of the old mine to assess structural stability and identify any environmental hazards that might need remediation. The survey team used modern ground-penetrating radar technology, equipment that could create detailed three-dimensional maps of underground spaces without physically entering unstable tunnels. The work began in spring of 2022 and continued through the summer, systematically scanning every accessible section of the mine complex. In September 2022, the survey team detected something anomalous in the region, corresponding to Section 9. The radar showed a sealed chamber behind what should have been solid rock, a space approximately 20 feet by 30 feet that didn't appear on any of the original mine maps. The structural engineer reviewing the data initially thought it might be a natural cavity, not uncommon in this geology, but the regular dimensions suggested human construction. The team flagged the finding for further investigation. The development company brought in mining specialists to evaluate whether it was safe to access the sealed chamber. After careful analysis of the surrounding rock and support structures, they determined that a controlled excavation could be performed with minimal risk. In November 2022, a crew began the careful work of removing the rock and timber barrier that had sealed Section 9 for 8 decades. They worked slowly, constantly monitoring for structural instability, prepared to abandon the effort if conditions became dangerous. On November 18, 2022, they broke through into the sealed chamber. What they found would finally solve a mystery that had haunted one family for generations and lay buried in historical records and an old diary. The chamber was indeed man-made, a section of tunnel that had been deliberately closed off. And it was not empty. Along the walls lay mining equipment, pickaxes and shovels and lanterns, the tools showing significant rust but still recognizable. More significantly, the excavation team found several pieces of timber that showed clear evidence of having been cut or partially sawed through before being incorporated into support structures. Most importantly, they found human remains. The skeleton was lying against the far wall of the chamber. The bones scattered somewhat, but still largely in anatomical position. The skull showed evidence of trauma, a fracture consistent with blunt force impact. Scattered around the remains were personal effects. A rusted lunch pail, the remnants of work boots, metal buttons from clothing, and most significantly, a small leather wallet containing identification papers. The papers, though damaged by decades of moisture and darkness, were still legible enough to read the name, Patrick Elias Morgan. The development company immediately halted all work and contacted local law enforcement. The county sheriff's department treated the site as a potential crime scene, even though any crime would have occurred more than 80 years earlier. They brought in forensic anthropologists from the state university to examine the remains, photographers to document everything in situ, and legal experts to determine how to proceed with what was clearly a historical homicide investigation. News of the discovery spread quickly, picked up by local media and then national outlets as the full story began to emerge. Catherine Rosenberg, now 74 years old, learned about the discovery from a news report. She immediately contacted the sheriff's department, informed them about her father's diary, about the documentation Silas Crane had kept, regarding the suspicious circumstances of Patrick Morgan's disappearance. The diary was submitted as evidence and proved to be remarkably accurate. Every detail Silas had documented, the silver discovery, the pressure from company officials, the suspicious visitors to Section 9, the timber with saw marks, aligned with what investigators were now finding in the sealed chamber. Forensic analysis of the remains confirmed that Patrick had died from blunt force trauma to the skull, a deliberate killing rather than accident or cave-in. The position of the body suggested he had been struck from behind, possibly ambushed in the tunnel. The sealed chamber had then been created by triggering a controlled collapse that blocked access while leaving the murder scene preserved behind tons of rock. It was a sophisticated cover-up, one that might have remained hidden forever, if not for modern surveying technology. Investigators also discovered something else in the sealed chamber, evidence that supported the theory of deliberate sabotage that Silas Crane had proposed decades earlier. Several of the tools found at the site had been modified in ways that made them more effective at weakening support structures without obvious damage. A crowbar had been sharpened and filed to create a precise cutting edge. A small saw had teeth specially configured for cutting through dense timber. These were tools designed for sabotage, not regular mining work, and their presence in a chamber that also contained Patrick Morgan's body strongly suggested he had discovered the sabotage operation and been killed to silence him. The investigation team tried to identify who might have been responsible for Patrick's murder. Raymond Burke, the mysterious worker who had supposedly been with Patrick on the day of the collapse, turned out to be a fiction. No employment records existed for anyone by that name. No evidence he had ever worked for the Silver Ridge Mining Company. He was likely an alias used by whoever had been hired to eliminate Patrick and seal Section 9. Dutch Holloway, the foreman who had been pressuring Patrick and Silas to increase production, died in 1968. Calvin Cross, the mine supervisor, passed away in 1955. Most of the company officials from that era were long gone, taking whatever knowledge they had about the conspiracy to their graves. But documentary evidence gradually emerged as researchers dug through archives and old records. Mining claim registrations from April of 1941 showed that the Silver Ridge Mining Company had filed extensive new claims covering an area that included and extended beyond Section 9. The claims were based on geological surveys that described a significant silver deposit, the same deposit Patrick and Silas had discovered. The claims were approved without challenge and generated substantial investment capital for the company. Over the following years, the expanded operations were quietly developed through tunnels accessed from different entry points, avoiding the sealed Section 9 entirely, but extracting the silver that Patrick and Silas had found. Financial records showed that key company officials, including Dutch Holloway and Calvin Cross, received substantial bonuses in late 1941, payments that couldn't be explained by normal operations or production levels. Those bonuses appeared to be rewards for successfully handling a problem, for removing obstacles to the company's control of the valuable silver deposit. The total value extracted from the expanded operations over the next decade was estimated at over $8 million in 1940s currency, equivalent to roughly $150 million in 2023 values. Patrick Elias Morgan had died so that wealthy investors could become wealthier, so that a mining company could maintain complete control over a discovery made by their employees, so that inconvenient questions about credit and compensation would never be asked. Silas Robert Crane had been murdered for the same reason, eliminated when he continued to push for answers about his friend's disappearance and the suspicious circumstances at the mine. Two men killed for the crime of doing their jobs well and discovering something valuable. The Nevada Attorney General's office announced in February 2023 that while criminal prosecution was impossible due to the deaths of all potential suspects, the case was officially classified as a double homicide. Patrick Elias Morgan's remains were released to his surviving family members, distant cousins, and their descendants who had maintained records of their lineage. He was buried in Missouri near where his sister had been laid to rest decades earlier, finally reaching the destination he had been traveling toward in March of 1941. Catherine Rosenberg worked with historians and the development company to create a memorial at the Silver Ridge mine site. A plaque was installed describing Patrick Morgan's discovery and his murder, acknowledging Silas Crane's efforts to document the truth, and honoring the memory of both men. The sealed chamber where Patrick's body had been found was carefully excavated and preserved as a historical site, part of a planned museum about Nevada mining history and the darker aspects of industrial labor during the early 20th century. In June of 2023, the museum opened to the public. Visitors could tour parts of the old mine, including a viewing platform overlooking the chamber where Patrick had been found. Displays included photographs of Patrick and Silas, excerpts from Silas's diary, explanations of the geological surveys and mining technology that had finally revealed the truth. The modified tools found at the murder site were exhibited as evidence of industrial sabotage and corporate criminality. The story attracted significant attention, featured in documentaries and true crime podcasts, studied by criminologists and labor historians as an example of how wealth and power could corrupt, could lead to murder in pursuit of profit. For Catherine Rosenberg and her family, the resolution brought mixed emotions. Relief that the truth was finally known, that her father's suspicions had been vindicated, that Patrick Morgan's fate was no longer a mystery, but also sadness for the decades of silence, for the fear that had prevented her mother from coming forward earlier, for the justice that could never be achieved because everyone responsible had escaped accountability by dying before the truth emerged. She spoke at the museum opening, her voice steady despite her tears, saying that her father and Patrick Morgan deserved to be remembered not just as victims, but as men of integrity who had stood up for what was right in a system designed to exploit and silence them. The story of Patrick Elias Morgan became part of Nevada's official historical record, taught in schools as an example of the human cost of industrial development, cited in discussions about worker safety regulations and corporate accountability. His name appeared in databases of cold cases that had been solved through advances in technology and persistent investigation. The Silver Ridge Mine, once a symbol of wealth and progress, became a reminder of darker truths about the price paid by ordinary workers in building that wealth. Modern mining companies operating in Nevada were quick to distance themselves from the practices of the past, to emphasize their safety protocols and labor protections, to condemn the actions of the Silver Ridge Mining Company as representative of a different era. But labor advocates and historians pointed out that the fundamental dynamics, the tension between profit and worker welfare, the power imbalance between ownership and labor, remained relevant issues in contemporary industry. Patrick and Silas's story served as a cautionary reminder that vigilance was necessary, that protecting workers required more than just regulations, but also enforcement and willingness to hold powerful interests accountable. In the end, justice came too late for Patrick Elias Morgan, 33 years old when he was murdered in a dark tunnel beneath the Nevada desert. Too late for Silas Robert Crane, 41 years old when he was killed for refusing to let his friend's death be forgotten. But their story survived, preserved in a diary kept by a man who understood the importance of documentation, in the determination of a daughter who honored her father's memory, in the persistence of researchers and investigators who believed truth mattered even across 8 decades. The sealed chamber gave up its secrets eventually, proved that murder could not remain hidden forever, that even the most carefully constructed cover-ups might eventually crumble under the weight of time and technology. Patrick had wanted stability, a future worth building, maybe enough to bring his sister out from Missouri to share in what he was creating. He found instead a grave in darkness, surrounded by the evidence of his own discovery, the silver that had been deemed more valuable than his life. Silas had wanted justice for his friend, had documented the truth, knowing it might cost him everything, and ultimately paid that price. Both men had believed that work had value, that integrity mattered, that a good discovery should be celebrated rather than punished. They were proven wrong by a system that valued profit over people, that saw workers as expendable resources rather than human beings with rights and dignity. The resolution of the case in 2023, the identification of Patrick's remains, the validation of Silas's diary, these developments couldn't undo the harm or restore what had been taken, but they could ensure the story was told, the truth was known, the victims were remembered. In a world where injustice often went unchallenged and the powerful frequently escaped consequences, there was something meaningful in the simple act of bearing witness, of saying these men lived, they mattered, what happened to them was wrong, and we remember. The desert wind still blows across Silver Ridge, carrying dust just as it did on that morning in March of 1941, when Patrick Elias Morgan walked toward the mine entrance with his lunch pail and thermos, not knowing he was walking toward his death. The tunnels beneath the earth are silent now, no longer echoing with the sound of pickaxes and blasting powder, no longer filled with men chasing silver in the darkness. But the story lives on, preserved in museums and documents, and the memories of those who learned about 2 miners who made a discovery, who stood at the intersection of ambition and greed, who paid the ultimate price for the crime of being honest workers in a dishonest system. Patrick Elias Morgan's case was solved, the mystery of his disappearance finally answered after 82 years of silence. The Nevada cold case that began with a tunnel collapse in 1941 ended with a sealed chamber revealed by modern technology in 2023, the truth emerging at last from beneath the earth where it had been buried, proving that some secrets cannot stay hidden forever, that justice, even delayed by decades, could still find its voice in the bones of the dead and the written words of those who refused to forget.